Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. I'm Abdul Faruqi and I've been practicing law for over 16 years now. And this channel, I would like to talk about legal insights, basically things that come to mind when I'm reading the news. Um, you know, I'm currently doing plaintiff's work, but I spent a lot of time as a criminal prosecutor and at the AG's office and at the DA's office investigating, price gouging, any kind of fraud, anything related to basically charging more than what it actually costs. And when the government's involved, the government will put time and resources into investigating these types of cases. But when it's individuals, especially in Texas and California, it really depends on a person making that complaint to their local law enforcement, whether it's the DA's office or whether it's the AG's office, to make a consumer complaint. And a lot of these things kind of fly under the radar or don't get the attention they deserve unless there's enough people making these complaints. And I feel like the tariffs that are being put into place create this situation where unscrupulous businesses will try to take advantage of consumers by tacking on a surcharge. So here's a couple of things that I want to cover today. I want to first break down what the tariffs actually are. Then we'll look at what the law says in Texas related to surcharges under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Then we'll talk about California a little bit because I'm licensed in California and I know some people wonder what the difference is between the state laws. And these are the two largest markets that in the United States with, we have significant populations in Texas and California that would be affected by these types of schemes. We'll go into some real life examples that I've seen in my practice and then give you some practical steps if you've been unfairly charged. So I'm not here to debate whether the tariffs themselves are good policy or not, even though I studied economics at the University of Texas at Austin, and there's this whole view about whether tariffs are helpful or not. That's a different conversation. It certainly is something that you need to be aware of in terms of your rights as a consumer and what businesses can and can't do when these costs come along. So a quick background on the tariffs themselves. Back in February, President Trump signed an executive order putting a 10% tariff on Chinese imports, and that was already on top of the 20% that was already there to begin with. Then in April, we got a 10% baseline tariff on pretty much everything coming into the country, with even higher rates for countries that we have big trade deficits with. And then there was a 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, and that's a big deal for states like Texas and California, where cross-border trade with Mexico is a huge part of the trade that we do. Now, these tariffs are real costs to businesses. That's not in dispute. But here's where it gets tricky. So businesses are handling this in different ways. Some of them are absorbing the cost. Some of them are just quietly raising prices. And then others are explicitly adding the line item to your bill saying like Trump tariff surcharge or something similar. I think that's where the legal aspect comes in, is when a business is trying to directly pass on the tariff and calling it a Trump tariff surcharge or something like that. That's where they can get into a little bit of trouble with the law. I've seen everything from some flat fees. Sometimes they'll charge an extra fee on top of the bill. Everything up to percentage-based surcharges, 10 to 25%. And people that are seeing this again are going to be businesses that are getting it from their suppliers. They'll say, hey, this is the extra charge for a tariff. The good news is that when I've been shopping for some other things, for example, I'm considering looking at a vehicle that I might need. There's some businesses explicitly saying like, hey, there's no Trump tariff or surcharge on this vehicle if you buy it before a certain date. So we aren't really seeing a lot of that for goods and inventory that are currently in the U.S., and I think that's a sign of an honest business person, that the inventory was already imported here before the tariffs took place, so it doesn't make sense for that business to add that charge for something that's already been here. They can certainly raise the price, but they shouldn't be adding the surcharge when the business itself didn't have to pay for the tariff. It might cost them more money in the long run to have to purchase that product again in the future, but we'll get to that in a second. So for the consumer protection laws in Texas, let's talk about Texas first. I spent my time at the Texas Attorney General's office working in a different division, the Civil Medicaid Fraud Division, but we were also joined with the Consumer Protection Division, and we saw, or at least I saw, a lot of cases involving the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act being prosecuted there. I also have experience dealing with that at the District Attorney's Office. And what makes the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act really powerful is that, unlike with fraud claims, you don't have to prove that the business intended to deceive you. They can have the best intentions in the world, but if they're misleading customers, it can still violate the law. So when it comes to these tariff surcharges, here are a few things that I look for. First of all, is there transparency? So the businesses need to tell you about the surcharges up front. It can't be a surprise at the checkout. Once someone is committed to the purchase and that charge is tacked on, that is a lack of transparency. And then the second thing that I look at is the accuracy. So, for example, if they're facing a 10% tariff on an item from China, now I don't know what the current tariff structure is with Chinese imports, and different imports are getting different amounts, so it's a little bit confusing. But let's just say hypothetically it's a 10% tariff and the item is $100, so there should be a $10 increase in the cost. But if they're adding like a $25 tariff surcharge on the same item, why is there an extra $15? That's where you may have a DTPA claim. And again, this is probably not going to show for most consumers who are buying stuff on Amazon.com, but it could be, people, I had a small side business that I tried out many years ago, importing things from China and reselling them in the U.S. And one of the things that came about in that business was dealing with Chinese suppliers, and they would list exactly, what they were charging you for, and if there was a tariff or a charge or whatever it might be, they would add that on. So, you will know, like the business that's importing the good will know how much they had to pay because of the tariffs. And so when they turn around and sell it, if they're the middleman and they're selling it to, let's say somebody's importing USB chargers from China to somebody who's going to sell it, maybe, in Houston, for example, we have a district, the Harwood district, so they're wholesalers. If the wholesaler is passing it on to a retailer, some additional costs, they could be in trouble if they're saying, oh, this is like the tariff charge of 10% or 20%. But when you go back and look at the paperwork, or you look at the tariffs information, that's not correct. So there are a number of layers that you'd have to look at to see where that surcharge is being passed on. It really hasn't trickled down to the individual consumers, but I think that's going to be coming in the coming months. And that's an area for investigation. And, they're not going to tell you exactly what their supplier said, it's a 10% increase, but we'll have to know what the prices were before and after. And, if they think, in my experience investigating fraud cases, a lot of businesses think that they're too small for the government to look at. But all it takes is a coordinated campaign of complaints, and pretty soon, you're going to start getting, especially if you're a business doing this, you're going to be getting civil investigative demands asking you for your records to show, they don't need probable cause, especially if it's a civil case. They can just make a demand upon good faith or good belief that something's happening, and suddenly you're in a situation where you have to comply with a lot of discovery without knowing the nature of the complaint, because a lot of those complaints are sealed. The fourth is a big one. A third one is truthfulness and labeling. If the business was planning to raise prices anyways and blames it on a tariff, that's potentially deceptive. There's a lot of reasons why prices go up in businesses. There's just inflation, supply and demand. Sometimes businesses want to avoid that contemplated price increase and blame it on the tariffs. That's one of the things that we saw with COVID, and nobody really did a COVID surcharge, but a lot of prices went up due to inflation. And we can complain about it all we want, but that's not illegal. But it's a different thing if you say it's due to Trump's tariffs. The fourth, the big one, is that the DPA prohibits what's called unconscionable action. So taking advantage of consumers who don't have specialized knowledge about international trade policy. Many businesses are counting on customers not knowing exactly how much these tariffs should actually affect prices, and that uncertainty. In economics, the idea of an efficient market is that the buyer and seller have all the information they need, and they know that the good or thing that they're transacting with is the you have perfect knowledge from the seller, perfect knowledge from the buyer, and they engage in an arm's length transaction, and they decide, like, this is what this good is worth. But oftentimes businesses know more and consumers know less. And that's where these laws exist, to protect the consumer who's not in a fair bargaining position. So let's look at California consumer protection laws. The laws are even tougher on businesses. In California, you have the unfair competition law. You'll find in the Business and Professions Code. It's broader than Texas in many ways, and here's how California really differs from Texas on this issue. First of all, California has what we call strict liability. So just like in Texas, you don't have to have the intention to mislead people. You can't defend yourself in California by saying you didn't intend to mislead anyone. If what you're doing misleads customers, then intent doesn't matter. Then they use something called a reasonable consumer test. And the question isn't whether the most sophisticated consumer would be misled, but whether an average reasonable person would be confused by how the surcharge is presented. And I got to tell you, I have a law degree, and these surcharges are confusing. I tend to question them personally, but I feel like I don't have a choice, so I pay it. And I think a lot of businesses take advantage of that. Like adding these regulatory compliance fees, these are sometimes things that you'll see in your cell phone bills, sometimes your cable bills. In Houston, for example, and then in Texas, we've had these issues with freezes and winterization of utilities, and there are rates that they want to pass on to consumers. Unfortunately, it's a regulated industry, so we have the Public Utility Commission, and we have local boards, and they ask permission. These utilities will ask permission to set these rate increases, and sometimes they're granted permission and sometimes they're not, but at least that process is regulated. When it comes to tariffs and adding that to the cost of goods, there isn't a whole lot of regulation. They don't have to ask permission to add this surcharge. The only protection you really have as a consumer is going to be your local attorney general or your district attorney going after businesses that are being unscrupulous and adding these charges. In Texas, you would get 2 years to bring that claim. So, it's 2025. You have about 2 years from, we're in April of 2025 now. You have about 2 years, or 2027, to bring a claim. In California, you get 4 years, so you get a longer period of time to bring these claims. And then finally, in Texas, if a business knowingly violates the DTPA, meaning that what they did was knowingly, it wasn't an accident, you can get treble damages, or you can get triple whatever harm you suffered. Now, in the case of these surcharges, if you got charged $15 more on a good and you get treble damages, 15 times 3, that's not a whole lot of money. You could potentially recover more than that, but really depends on the nature of your damages. In California, it's more focused on making the business stop the practice, and so you get some injunctive relief and some restitution as well. So, you can essentially shut down a business for a period of time if it's engaging this type of conduct. So there is a lot more enforcement potential in California. But practically speaking, I think when it comes to these types of damages, you're going to need several people joining together to bring this action. So if consumers are facing this, they need to be reporting this en masse so that the Attorney General's office can take a look at these cases. So, let me give you a hypothetical of what this might look like. So let's say there's a company that is somewhat political, and they basically have been importing goods from, let's say, Mexico or China, and they want to charge like a flat fee, and $5 flat fee, and call it a Trump tariff surcharge to every order. And truly, there's probably an increased cost of business that's associated with the market environment, right? They're not exactly sure as a business exactly what percentage of their increased cost of inputs is due to the surcharge. It could be inflation, it could be tariffs, but they haven't done the due diligence to go down and see what that cost is. Rather than simply passing it off to their customers, they want to make a political statement and they want to say it's the Trump tariff surcharge. Now, is that legal? It depends. If they're importing products that are worth $20, they're subject to a 10% tariff, that's a $2 cost increase, then charging a flat $5 surcharge fee, that's excessive. Similarly, if there's a car dealership and they want to hit it with a $1,500 tariff adjustment on a vehicle, but only $600 worth of parts were actually subject to the new tariffs, again, that's misleading, right? Because only $600 worth of parts were subject to the tariff, but they're doing $1,500 for the whole vehicle. That's not going to be an appropriate adjustment to the vehicle if they're blaming it on the tariffs. Electronic retailers are another big one. Let's say they have 5 to 15% increase in the cost of purchases, and if they, for example, say it's the Trump tariff, many electronic components aren't subject to the full tariff rates, and a lot of that has to do with negotiation by the tech industry that's been working to get exemptions from the administration. So what the pattern is that businesses will probably do in this environment is that they're going to apply surcharges to the entire purchase when only some components are affected. They're going to charge flat fees that don't scale with the actual tariff impact, and they're using tariffs as cover for general price increases that they want to make anyways. The legal question comes down to, is the surcharge proportional to the actual increased cost, and are they being upfront about it? So what can you as a consumer do about it? So I've kind of talked a little bit about businesses and if they want to do a surcharge, they need to, like if you're a business, you need to really carefully look at your inputs and figure out what actually relates to the surcharge and what doesn't. If you have a tax or you have a licensing fee that you want to distribute to your customers, that's pretty easy to find, but a surcharge can be a little bit harder. I don't think it's worth doing for a number of reasons, but I think first of all is just the compliance angle of it. How do you actually know, unless you're directly hit with that fee and you can point to something, it's going to be misleading for you to take a generalized increase in cost of doing business and blaming it on the tariffs. So I wouldn't do that. Now let's say if you're the customer, what do you do if you think you've been hit with an unfair surcharge? In Texas, what you have to do is you got to save everything. Keep your receipts, take screenshots of an online order, save the emails, document any conversations you're having with agents. Evidence is everything in these cases. You got to send what's called a 60-day demand letter before you can file a lawsuit. So a lot of people, they'll turn to the AG's office, but you can actually hire private counsel to help you with this. It gives the businesses 2 months to fix the problem. And many businesses will settle at this point because they know under the DTPA they can be on the hook for treble damages and attorney's fees if they lose. If the business doesn't respond or offer a fair settlement, you have options for smaller claims under $20,000. In Texas, you can go to small claims court, or it's usually justice of the peace, and you don't need to bring an attorney. For larger cases, you want to consult with someone who specializes in consumer protection. You got a 2-year deadline from when that surcharge was applied. If you're in California, the process is similar, but you've got 4 years to file, not 2, and the standard is whether a reasonable consumer would be misled by how the surcharge was presented. Now, if it's a small charge, like $5 or $10, it may not be worth pursuing individually, and that's where you may just refer that to the AG's office to handle. But, I have been looking and I haven't really found class action attorneys, but this is probably an area that they may jump into. This is where class actions come in. If thousands of consumers are facing the same improper surcharge, class action can make it economically viable to pursue. There'd have to be a law firm that is advertising this type of mass action or class action, and consumers have to find it and be able to agree to be part of the class, and then that's where you can increase the amount of damages involved. So in conclusion, look, I don't think all of the tariff surcharges are illegal. There probably are some valid ones, but businesses that are dealing with a real increase in cost, they have a right to pass it on to consumers, but the way they do it matters. In many cases that I've seen involving fraud, a lot of businesses have a viable, legitimate way of operating, but because they want to squeeze out 10 to 20% more, you know, more returns on their investment, or even more than that, they get tempted to do something that's illegal or not compliant with the law, hoping that the government won't catch them. And the government has a much longer period of time to investigate fraud cases. The typical statute of limitations that applies for most cases don't apply um, for different kinds of fraud because it takes longer to detect them. Transparency is everything in the way that you handle your business. You got to be honest about the charges, how they're calculated. You got to do your homework, and you got to have a paper trail. As a customer, you got to stay vigilant and ask questions. If the surcharge seems excessive or comes as a surprise, speak up. Many businesses will remove it if you challenge it. If you do run into a situation where you think a business is using the tariffs as an excuse for price gouging, document everything and don't hesitate to reach out to a consumer protection attorney. And I'd be happy to answer those types of questions for you if you had any. I hope this has been helpful. And if you got any questions about a specific situation you're dealing with, drop them in the comments below and I'll address them in a future